The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Good evening, good morning, good day. We don't know when you're listening to this, but whenever it is, welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast. I am Greg, your host who knows nothing about these books, including The Shadow Rising, Book 4 of the Wheel of Time saga, of which today we will be discussing 3 chapters, Chapter 14, Chapter 15, and Chapter 16. And joining me, as always, is a man who knows a lot more about these, and I will say, told me on Friday, who knows when we're recording, that he was very excited for these chapters, which made me immediately assume I was going to learn the name of our podcast this week, which I believe you just heard him tell me I don't get to know that yet. And then when I got to segment with columns mentioned, I got excited, and then there were no glass ones. So
correct.
That man who did all that was Tylor. Tylor, how's it going?
It's going very well. First off, we need to change the introduction at some point, because you saying you know nothing about a series that you have now read a fifth of is not as accurate as it once was. It's also worth noting this is the beginning of the wind-up as far as I'm concerned. I think at the end of the last episode, I mentioned one of the chapters this week is one of the most discussed and reread. I think now that you've read all 3 of them, you know which of those that likely is. And this is kind of where I feel like this series kind of gets going. Right? It's not up to speed yet, but this is the first moment that I go, oh, Robert Jordan is no longer playing the set the table game. It feels like he's actually getting those pieces moving. Did you feel that same kind of momentum this week as well? Or were you like, oh no, this isn't what I thought it would be, so it was a letdown?
I would say I was feeling some momentum. I don't know that I was like, powder keg roller coaster time, but I was definitely feeling like things were moving. And I joked last book episode that, I mean, maybe we're recording non-book episodes. Who knows what we're doing? But I believe I noted that we'd been in this pattern for a while that felt like the middle of Les Mis, where it's like one day more. And it felt like while this is another one day more week, it really felt like by the time we get to the end of these chapters that we were on the next day and it was action time and things were actually happening. So so I would say mostly agree with you, but held back just a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. This is still kind of the early stages of this buildup, so we're not all completely feeling it. But let me tell you, the slope may be subtle, but we are finally getting some motion going now. I don't really have too much else to say about these 3 chapters broadly, mostly because many of the things I want to say require that you have read chapter 15, and I know some of our listeners listen to these episodes chapter by chapter instead of as a whole. So is there any last thoughts you have overall before we dive into chapter 14, Customs of Mayene?
Tylor, would you please tell me about the customs of Mayene?
That would actually be a much more disturbing conversation than what I am about to do. Aaron thinks that Matt will never go to the 2 rivers, but he must. He has a bruise from a wound on his side that he thinks would have been lethal without Fael helping him, and he starts thinking about how he's prepared for everything except not having a plan for Fael and how he is going to keep her away from the 2 rivers. At this point, Berelaine enters his room. She asks if he is leaving and says that she is as well. He asks why she's telling him this, and she says that she wants him to pass along notice to the dragon. And she basically makes it clear that she is afraid to go see him in person, but Perrin both is confused by this and also refuses to carry her message. At this point, Berelaine's kind of perspective changes, and she clearly sizes up Perrin, likes what she sees, and invites him to join her for, quote, an entertaining blacksmith job that she references will specifically take place in her bedroom. At this point, Fail enters, saying that she has heard a rumor. Berelain provocatively runs a hand down Perrin's back, clearly trying to get a rise out of Fail. Fail notes that Perrin is packing. He insists that he's leaving immediately and planning to use the ways to get home. And she warns him about the dangers of the ways, and she seems shocked when he says that he's already traveled in them before. She insists that she is coming with him, but Perrin says that he's going to be going alone with Loyal, and Fail basically ignores him, insists she is coming, and then she says she needs to go and mocks the idea of Berelain going with Perrin at all or even being interested in him. And then at this point, basically, we switch into Perrin thinking after she leaves, and he thinks to himself all of the things that he wishes he could say, that he killed a white cloak, that he's going probably to die, that he intends to kind of sacrifice himself, and then he thinks to himself that he would like to howl with grief. We then switch into Fail's perspective. She is rushing down the hallway, furious at Berelain and at Perrin, and eventually she catches up with Berelain. She shouts that Perrin belongs to her. Berelain responds that Saldean farm girls seem to have odd ideas about ownership, and in her mind, Fail starts running through all of the things that she knows about the Saldean court and how she suspects Berelain wouldn't be able to keep up there. At this point, Fail basically lost my place in my notes. At this point, Fail says that if Berelain tries to go after Perrin, that she will do what women in Saldia do to people who steal their men, that is shave them bald. And at this point, Berelain shows that she is just as good with a knife as Fail, if not better, as she does some like kung fu flip stuff and gets a knife to her throat. The two of them basically have a very tense standoff, neither of them backing off until eventually Ruark arrives. He breaks up the fight. He sends Berelain relatively petulantly to her room, referencing a previous conversation that they had, and then he keeps Fail's knives, saying that Berelain's punishment was to send her away in front of Fail, and Fail's punishment is that she doesn't get to keep her knives. Fail then thinks about what Ruark said about Ogier oath breakers, which he previously referenced when he was saying that Berelain wouldn't want to break her oaths, and then at this point, Fail walks away smiling. We find out what that's about in a couple of chapters. This is the relationshipiest of our three chapters this week. Did it land for you? What are you thinking about this kind of love triangle that's emerging?
I mean, the simple answer to that is like this was definitely the least of the three chapters tonight. It
Yeah.
was fine enough, but I think I'm finding myself having trouble caring that much about Berlane. It's
Yeah.
like, I don't think I'd clocked her till she appeared in the early chapter and tried to seduce Rand, and then this chapter I think is turning that character into more of a like kind of a caricature and a
Mhm.
stereotype. It's like, oh, she's just in for whatever man is convenient. And the wordplay about some ironwork and all that, like, yeah,
Yep.
it made me I was gonna say it made me titter, but that felt inappropriate. But I giggled like a small schoolboy that I am. And so some of those pieces worked, but I think we've established before that particularly when he's writing about women in regards to relationships, it's not Robert Jordan's strong suit, perhaps. And
Yeah.
um, you know, my notes on the second half of the chapter were just subtitled, in which the Wheel of Time determinedly follows the Bechdel test, right?
Yep.
Like it's like,
Yep.
wait, let's get these two really interesting characters on their own and have them only talk about a boy. So yeah, funny moment in that chapter.
That is 100% accurate. This chapter, I agree with you. I think it's the slightest of the three, and it falls into Robert Jordan's kind of pitfall, right? What he wants to be doing is having all of his characters draw kind of broad-based, like um, what's the word I'm looking for? And assumptions, I guess. Like he wants his characters to be thinking about women in one way and men in another way, and then he eventually wants to hopefully break that down. The problem with that strategy is that it does involve a whole lot of writing characters that sound like they are stereotypes of the gender roles that Robert Jordan is ostensibly trying to break down. And I think that really stands out to me in this chapter, right? Berelain, she in previous chapters felt like she had this really strong motivation, and we kind of saw the political machinations behind what she was doing. That doesn't seem to exist in this chapter. And so that makes it a little bit more difficult to kind of take her as like a fully well-rounded, developed character. That being said, I have one very small detail that comes up in this chapter, I believe for the first time, that may at least give us slightly more intrigue about where this plot line is going. We did get one or two references in this chapter to the seal of Mayene, or the symbol that stands for it. And it is a hawk, which wouldn't mean anything if Min had not had about 8 different visions about a falcon and a hawk fighting over Perrin. We may be seeing the beginning of that prophecy fulfilled in this
Hmm.
chapter. I don't know if that's enough to get you excited about the Beryllian Fail thing, but at least it's been foretold, probably.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the characters had just to pull into the stereotype issue you mentioned. It's like I do think there when we are critiquing how a male author writes women or how a white author writes
Yeah.
characters of color, I think we have to put some rightful skepticism towards it while also leaving room for representing, as you just articulated, how a character views somebody versus
Yeah.
how a writer views somebody. And what comes to mind for that, I think we're both West Wing fans, and there's some really awful West Wing gender relations.
Yeah.
I think there's an episode called like These Women, which is just like really patronizing at the end. And like, I'm not here to defend Aaron Sorkin with women. Nobody should. But also like um those West Wing characters, as much as they're like good people, they're not the types that would have nuanced gender understandings, right?
Yeah.
They're kind of 90s political hacks. It's like, yeah, they would not be enlightened by our modern standards. So to apply that to here, I think you're right. And when Perrin says something like, are these the customs? Is she just a spoiled woman?
Yep.
That's kind of sticks in your craw a bit, but that is how a rural boy would probably think about a royal from that
Yeah.
kind of customs.
Yeah, and it's worth noting the title of this chapter comes from something that Moraine said to the girls about 5, 10 chapters ago when they were complaining about Berylane being in Rand's quarters, and her response was, "She doesn't understand your customs, and you don't understand the customs of Mayenne." And so the idea that there's kind of like a cultural relativism going on here, where the way that Perrin is viewing Berylane is not the same as how Berylane is viewing Berylane, I think is really interesting, and I think you're right to be highlighting that. Um, Other than that, though, boy, is there a lot. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. There is not a lot else going on in this chapter. There is the conflict between the two girls. There is Perrin trying to push away Fail, and that is it. Were there any like small details or kind of character beats that really stood out to you? I've got maybe one or two, but this feels like a chapter where we're digging into the details, not the plot.
uh Another, who knows when we're writing, but maybe some flashy director who thinks of himself as deserving a longer cut of Justice League. I don't know who I could be referencing. Just came out with a sci-fi movie where he was saying, I'm going to show the world how to make a sci-fi movie. And when everything came out, it was basically like, oh, he just remade Seven Samurai and pretended it was original. And
Yeah.
so Seven Samurai is on my mind, and the opening kind of plan as they're thinking about returning to Two Rivers, in my head, I'm going, they're setting up a Seven Samurai plot, right?
Mhm.
And this is, so in Star Wars world, we talk about this a lot because George Lucas took a Kurosawa film called Hidden Fortress and he adapted it and made Star Wars A New Hope. And if you are deep into Star Wars, there are like 5 times they've retold the film Seven Samurai.
Yeah.
And, Stephen King also did it in The Dark Tower. And, it's just a very common kind of story to pull off. And so when Zack Snyder just came out and was like, I'll show you how to make a sci-fi movie, Star Wars people who won't hire me. And then you're like, oh, this is just a really boring Seven Samurai story. It's
Yeah.
like the same thing. So anyway, all of that is context that my hackles were up. And so when they're talking about like, well, we're gonna need to train and we're gonna go there, I'm like, is this a Seven Samurai plot? Are Fail and Perrin gonna go back and have to train up the villagers in Two Rivers in order to fight off the White Cloaks? It seems like in 1993, 4, whenever this was written, that wouldn't have been as hacky as that feels now.
Yeah.
And yet I kind of want a little better from Robert Jordan. So I'm not putting that down as a prediction, but that is kind of a fear as I go through that early part of the chapter.
I just want to point out we are 5 samurai short at this point, right? Like part of the seven samurai plot is train up the villagers, but part of it is acquire all of the random, really strong people from all around the world. We haven't done that yet, but should we? You are 1,000% correct. That is the plot that is being ripped off here. Um, I think you're exactly right. The only kind of interesting thing to me, kind of embedded in that, is that Fail immediately upon hearing the rumor, A, assumes we must go, and then B, assumes that they are going to be going in a much more conventional way than Perrin originally proposes. And I thought I thought Fail's response to the idea of going through the ways was really fun, right? She is immediately all in. I am an adventurer. I want to do this. And then Perrin's like, we're going to go through the ways. And she's like, whoa, that's a horrible idea. And I thought that like real quick change in her perspective did a really good job of highlighting for me exactly who Fail is. She can come in super confident, but also she's not Matt who just does things and doesn't think about them. She clearly has that degree of worry for her own life.
Well, a good point and a reminder to the audience that just because our characters have used this before does not mean this is safe, right? It
Yeah.
it is a kind of effective way to reestablish that the tension remains and that it could be risky. So,
Yeah.
I appreciated that gesture in it as well. And, I apologize if some of this is from the later chapter, but they're like talking again about the black wind and all and
Yeah.
it is like, oh, it's been a while since we really thought about the ways, and there was a kind of real darkness and a
Yeah.
set of powers we didn't understand. And we get a lot of those reminders in these chapters,
Yeah.
which I assume when we perhaps in, say, chapter, I don't know, 18, go into the ways, I assume we'll get to re-experience a lot of these things. So it's
Yeah.
important that they kind of remind us what we might have forgotten over the course of the last 3 books.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. One last little detail I had about Fail, and then I am out of things for this chapter, honestly. When Berelaine accuses Fail of being just another farm girl, Fail's internal monologue immediately switches to a litany of things that she learned in the court of Seldia that she thinks Berelaine would not be prepared for. And that set off 2 warning bells for me. One is Fail having that much training in courtly intrigue, I don't think is necessarily something we knew about her. And 2, she says her father is a fur trader, and I don't know why a fur trader's daughter would have that much knowledge about the court intrigue of Saldia. And so that kind of paragraph of thought internally really kind of made me think, what is going on with Fail, and is there information about her that we don't know that this would suggest otherwise? Did that or anything else in this chapter kind of raise any alarm bells about her maybe doing the same selective information thing that we know Perrin is doing?
I thought I clocked a little of what you're talking about, and I just felt like there were these hints that she is not exactly in control the way we've seen other characters not be in control. There's a little bit of kind of arguing with herself. We've
Mhm.
talked about, obviously Matt comes to mind most often, but the old blood came out in some of the other boys. We know that Perrin kind of has the wolfiness, and we don't have any reason to think that's true of Fail, except
Yeah.
that we're getting these hints that there's something else going on here. And it made me think, okay, is this another way in which a previous age is coming through and acting?
Mm.
To your point, not hints we have that she would be a figure like that, but it does start. It felt to me like we could ask that same question of who's in control of
Mm.
Fail here, because there's a lot of times where she, it's expressed as she bit her tongue or she says it all in her head without saying it out loud. And that all felt a little similar to Matt in particular, that like, oh,
Yeah.
these are things she's not fully in control of. I mean, I just want to emphasize from my notes, since you said you were wrapping up yours, it seems to me the real point here is to clock Ruark's first conversation.
Yeah.
And you haven't repeated that since your summary because there's not a lot to say about it, but it's like, as plain as can be, there was a first conversation that he laid
Yeah.
down the law or had some kind of conflict, and we don't know exactly what that was, but that seems really important in unraveling this character.
It is worth
Um,
noting just the timing of that. I believe Ruark says it was a few days ago, which would suggest that it was
mhm.
probably immediately after Bearlane was in Rand's quarters. But please continue.
And then you've asked me other weeks, these many weeks we've been taking this journey, how are the Aiel in particular in this book kind of shaping up and separating themselves? And I will say, I think these chapters this week, there's obviously another one to mention later, but it starts to feel like we are seeing kind of Aiel go from the crowd into the kind
Yeah.
of cast of characters we need to track and we need to follow a lot. I always think of I just Lost was such a formative television experience for me, and everybody was like, "Oh, who are all these random survivors in the back? We want to know their story. We want to know their story." And so the producers were like, "Okay, here's Nikki and Paolo. Here's their story." And it's like, we hate this story. We don't like
Yeah.
these characters. Go back to the characters we like. And so when I see an author kind of actively promoting characters in that way, I always think like, is this going to add meaningfully to the story we're told? Or am I going to like these characters, or is this going to be like, oh, actually, there's a reason sometimes background characters are in the background? But I will say, from where I'm sitting now, it feels like Aiel and Aiel society and Aiel mythology are more a part of the end game of this fantasy book series than I imagined they were.
Yeah.
So I am excited at the moment. I think these are going to be meaningful to seemingly have two or three Aiel on different strands of this book.
That's a really good call. I can say absolutely nothing more about it because I know everything that happens with the Aiel in this book. I assume, given that you were going off of the idea that was my last thought, we are good to move on to the next chapter, chapter 15. He's nodding.
Yes,
Excellent.
indeed.
Chapter 15, Into the Doorway. Matt stands in the bowels of the stone, noting that there has been recent kind of clearing of dust in an ajar door, but he is focusing on Nynaeve's instructions for how to find the twisted door frame. Eventually, he reaches the redstone doorway. He pushes at it. It doesn't fall over. And then he steps through. There is a bright white light, and then he is somewhere else. He sees a man who seems to have the eyes and skin of a snake and says that he has come according to agreement and asks whether or not he has iron or musical instruments. Eventually, he is basically walked through a large kind of chamber. There are a large number of windows, and as he looks out of them, there's a really exotic, odd landscape. And every window he looks out, something is significantly different to the point that it seems like space is kind of warping around him to some degree. He eventually arrives in a large central chamber. And he kind of lays out the entirety of his situation. It says in the narration he is very, very careful to avoid asking any questions in doing so. And then he asks his first question: should I go home to my people? He is told, you must go to Roidion. A bell tolls and then another. He then hears the snake people saying he is another, the strain, and kind of complaining about the strain and also demanding that Matt goes quicker. At this point, Matt thinks about the other things he was planning to ask about, both Aes Sedai and his missing memories, but instead he is so angry that he asks the question, why should I go to Roidion? And he is told, you will die if you do not go to Roidion. Another bell rings, the strain is too great, and he asks, why will I die if I don't go to Roidion? And he receives the response, you will have sidesteps the thread of fate. Matt then refuses to leave, asking a fourth question, what fate? He is told that he is fated to marry the daughter of the Nine Moons, to die and live again, a part of what was, and to give up half the light of the world to save the world. They call him the son of battles, the trickster, and the gambler. And then there are two more rings of the bell before Matt is dragged to another doorway and thrown out of it. He tries to go back through the doorway, and it doesn't work. He stays in the bowels of the stone. He bemoans the prophecies, thinking that he doesn't want to marry a noble woman. And at this point, Rand steps out. They have a brief conversation about whether the snakes inside of the doorway are liars. Rand insists that they are not. And at this point, Moiraine steps through as well. She seems frustrated that the other boys have gone through, is a little bit upset. She asks whether Perrin is in there as well. And then Rand says that he learned where this was from a book. Matt claims he also learned from a book, although it is the least convincing lie I have ever seen written down on paper. And then both
then both Rand and Moiraine talk about how difficult the conversation was because they had to interact with a translator because everyone was speaking the old tongue, which of course surprises Matt because he didn't realize he was speaking the old tongue the entire time. They Moraine explains why the snake people are willing to do this. They say that they take experiences and sensations and then give the answers, which are all true. She offers to interpret the answers for Rand, and Rand tells her that he will give her his answers once she gives him hers. At this point, they all walk away, and Matt asks Rand whether or not he is going to ignore the two rivers, to which he replies he has more important things to do. This is the chapter I was previewing at the beginning, right? There's a lot of stuff here. There's some interesting prophecies. Is this one of those that you read and go, yeah, I'm excited? Or is this one of those moments where Greg and Tylor diverge because you're not a prophecy fan?
I think somewhere in the middle of that. I'm just splitting all your differences tonight, which makes for great podcast content if all I do is say kinda. As I thought about this chapter, actually the thing that came most to mind, I'll get my goofy thing out of the way first. The thing that came most to mind was the Dungeons and Dragons movie where they use the spell to talk to the corpses, and I don't remember exactly how it goes, but it's like, oh, so you died? Yes. So we can ask you 5 questions. Yes. Wait, do those count? Yes. And then he dies again or whatever. And it felt like completely obvious that Matt was blowing this to us, and yet he could not stop himself from completely blowing it as a part of that. Is this an exciting chapter? Absolutely. And I think I will say it's maybe the second half that got me excited because, even when the figurine, I was thinking more like strain as in like string, right? Like something about the fates. And then in hindsight, you're like, oh, it's because they are balancing 3 really powerful entities within their spell at the same moment. So the really good twist at the end where the other characters exit at the same time, that's when I was like, oh wow, like this is really good. It becomes one of those frustrating moments where it's like if the characters just told each other everything, then this would be a shorter book series, but characters are gonna character and they're just not gonna let that happen. So so that is both exciting and frustrating at the end, I would say, because you're like, oh, just share, or I want to know. And as much as this has always been a book in a limited narration from, first person narrator from a different perspective, he doesn't lean into that a lot, but I feel like he's finding a way to play with that a lot more in this book. And so this moment where, it could easily have been a Rand chapter or Moiraine, or we could have gotten subsequent chapters of them or previous chapters of them. And instead it's like, you just get to know this little bit from Matt's perspective and you got to deal with it. And that's frustrating in a fun way.
So in that case, I have a follow-up question, which is about the end of the chapter, but I think it's a fun kind of game to play. The question that lingers after this chapter to me is, what did Rand ask? What did Moiraine ask? And what answers did they get that might change the way that they would behave going forward? Now, interestingly, if you are someone who has read this series, I know that's not you, Greg, but some of our listeners, it's worth noting we do know the answer to Rand's questions. They were in Robert Jordan's notes that were available at the Citadel Library if you go in person and look them up. So I happen to know the answer to that. But otherwise, this is a great mystery of the series. What did Rand ask? Any hypotheses with absolutely no information?
Well, actually, I was at the Citadel yesterday and I saw them. No. That's very cool. And I was just telling my current students about how lucky they are and how burdened they are by the fact that when you're a researcher today, you can get anything online. And like, I loved when I was a student, was still a time I wanted a book at the Cornell Library. So I had to get in my car and go across this great state of Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, into the great state of New York and get it myself. So I had immediately linked Rand and whatever he's asking to the fact that he's become so obsessed with his prophecies, right? So the fact we know he's reading. So I imagine that he would use this opportunity to interpret what some of those prophecies are telling him, right? I don't know if that's, to untangle contradictory prophecies, to ask what some line might mean.
Mhm.
But I imagine that is kind of where his head seems to be at over the
Yeah.
last couple days. I mean, we do know, back to my Les Mis joke, that he is currently trying to decide literally what he's going to do tomorrow, or he has
Yeah.
some sense of what he wants to do, and it might try to be confirming that. So there could be a more immediate question in the mix, but I assume he's trying to place himself into a longer strand, a longer bit of this
Yeah.
prophecy, and trying to figure out his placement in it.
I buy those theories. They are not entirely all wrong. And we're going to move on to the beginning of the chapter so I don't spoil anything that is literally not even in any of the books. Um, the
Wait,
begin-
wait, wait! I want to answer for Moraine too.
Oh,
I want
yes,
to,
please do.
even if that's not appropriate. I want to take a guess. So
This one I don't
I
know
was
the answer
thinking,
to, by the way.
sure. I was thinking a lot about how in this moment I am reading Moraine as kind of questioning her faith. I was gonna say allegiance there, and I paused and said faith, because I don't think she's, really thinking that Rand is about to betray her or something like that. Like, she is loyal to him, but I imagine after all this work she did to help get the dragon in place, that she is now nervous about the way forward. So
Yeah.
I see this character at this moment kind of and that to me is a really interesting place, because we know she can't ask questions about Rand's future. She can
Right.
only ask questions about her own future. So that could be, should I continue to help Rand? Should I go travel with the dragon, or should I go somewhere else? It could be very logistical,
Mhm.
but I feel like she's in a larger kind of crisis moment where, he disappeared for a book from her, and their reunion seems to have been rocky and their relationship a little
Mm.
testy. So I wonder if this is a moment when she might use these questions to do that. All right, go to the beginning of the chapter, because I'm sure you can't comment on that at all.
That is accurate. Can't say a damn word. The early parts of this chapter, I find, to me, are really all about setting up kind of the high magic of this, right? This is the first time that we've had like planar travel other than the portal stones. It's the first time that we've seen, other than Ogier and Trollocs, some sort of like other fantasy race. And I think there's a lot of moments early on in this chapter that are just purely designed to get you out of the traditional Wheel of Time headspace and into a completely different world. I was just curious. To me, the thing that stood out is the windows. Matt looking out of them and seeing things that looked like 5 miles away. He walks, 5 feet down the path, and it looks like it's only a mile away. Were there any other kind of details in that vein that either stood out to you or intrigued you, or just kind of the setting in general? It feels like it's a very different chapter than a lot of what we've seen before. How did you feel about that kind of change in, almost like low fantasy to high fantasy to some degree?
I felt weird, Tyler. I felt weird. No, I what stuck out to me the most is this guide, who is described very clearly as not human. And
Mhm.
actually, I told you before we began recording, I stumbled my way into a long conversation about this podcast and what I'm doing
Yeah.
in some dealings with family yesterday. And one of the things they were asking me was like, well, what are the books like? What are they about? And I was like, well, they are fantasy, but they're not Lord of the Rings fantasy. They're not, and I don't always know high, low, but I'm like, there aren't other races. I mean, we have Trollocs, but
Yeah.
most people are just humans with some magic and kind of a defined power set. And so I felt like this guide figure that seems to be snake-like in some way and yet kept vague. He's not described as actually having a snake's body, but like skin and hair that kind of appears like scales, and
Yeah.
it's more like evocative of a snake than it is a snake, as I understood it. And that is really intriguing to me, because it felt different. It felt
Yeah.
like, oh, this might not just be a human. It might be a different creature. So that stood out more to me than the kind of long passageway
Okay.
plane travel. I think we've disclosed before, I'm a huge Doctor Who fan. So like when you walk in the door and it's suddenly a big space, I'm like, yeah, cool, well, I know how that works.
Yeah.
It's a pocket dimension. So
Fair enough. I immediately, when you were describing this guide, he has like snake-like skin and snaky eyes. I immediately was like, "Oh, I know exactly what that looks like." I feel like, and then I was about to reference the single most obscure hip hop album I am aware of. If any of you know what the cover of Zartificial Intelligence by Czarface looks like, the snake guy on that is what I picture here. But that's not helpful for anyone but me. Um, I I guess to some degree, if that's the weirdness at the beginning of the chapter, then all of this is about A, what Matt was going to ask, which was very smart, and B, what he did ask, which didn't get him much until he broke the rules and asked a fourth question. Other than that just being the maddest thing I've ever heard, what was your take on kind of Matt's rolling failure throughout the middle portion of this chapter, his inability to get any of the information he really wanted?
Yeah, I mean, it feels, I mean, we joked before, but this feels like a Twilight Zone episode or something, right? Where your character gets what they wanted, which is a chance to ask questions of a clairvoyant mystic, and yet fails to get the actual information they want. To me, the most intriguing part, and I want to make sure I have this, he has to go to this place out in the wastes
Yep.
to escape his fate, which is to marry somebody and die, right?
He,
Like he's gonna die.
he needs to go to Roydian to avoid the death, but doing so will
Yeah.
result in him marrying the daughter of the Nine Moons.
Oh, okay. And so we get this kind of intriguing piece that's the daughter of the Nine Moons. Is that
Correct.
yes? And so we have no idea who that is. We don't know whether this world has one or multiple moons.
This world has one moon because it is Earth, and the moon is the moon.
Okay.
But it's worth noting we have had one reference to the Court of Nine Moons in the prologue of this book. That was the name given by Suroth to the Empress and her family in Shanchan.
Wait, there was no prologue in this book.
Oh, I'm
This
sorry,
book?
chapter 1.
Yeah. Ha. Knowledge.
Nailed
Take
it.
that. Okay. So there's some connection to the Shan Chan have the Court of the Nine Moons, and we're now being given a reference to the daughter of the Nine Moons.
Yeah.
But that to me, I continue to try to wrap my head around geography, because we are sending everybody very far east when we know the Shanchan are very far west.
Correct.
And of course, the way geography works is if you go far enough east, you eventually get to the far west. But I would be I would be hugely surprised if we actually circumnavigated Earth, and this is Earth as you're talking about it, so you claim. So I think that sounds to me like, again, we've got a tension there.
Yeah.
But is there an older connection? Is the Aiel kind of deep history of the Aiel somehow tied to the deep history of Hawking and whatever became the Shan Chan? That's intriguing. That I obviously didn't catch that reference.
Yeah.
And I mean, I do think the main reaction I had to what happened inside the vision is just like, come on, dummy. Like, you saw this a million miles away, and yet you couldn't get it together. And so it's a little bit of a frustrating experience, but you know, I guess my assumption coming out of it is he will follow these directions and go to Rudian, is how you say it.
I know Roy is the first syllable. I don't know if it's Roydian or Roydeen or Roydian. I don't know the last syllable, but RHUI is somehow Roy.
Roydian, like Greedo. And so I then immediately, and even when I was reading this chapter, I was like, oh, so is he and Egwene are catching the same bus into the Wastes? Are they going to travel together? Are they going to join forces, or is he still so suspicious of the Aes Sedai? Either him or the thing controlling him is so suspicious of the Aes Sedai, he wouldn't allow that and he would want to go on his own.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I hadn't even made the connection to the fact that Egwene and Avienda are heading in exactly the same direction. That's a good call. I just want to note, even if we don't have much to say about them, the other big pieces of this prophecy, right? So to marry the daughter of the Nine Moons, to die and live again, to give up half of the light of the world to save the world. And then we get three titles for Matt that all feel appropriate: Son of Battles, Trickster, and Gambler. Do any of those kind of bring up anything? You have any thoughts about a couple of those that are kind of forward looking? This is make bad predictions time, I suppose.
I mean, I continue to wonder who they're making predictions about. Is this
Yeah.
Matt of the Two Rivers, or is this the presence that is present within Matt? I mean, I think it's a little confusing when you have a kind of metaphysical manifestation here that is reading him in some way. So the gambler and the trickster sound much more like the thing inside of Matt at the moment, or
Mhm.
that which we know is tainted with the Dark One's luck. So, Trickster also brings up, a classic archetype from mythology. Most people immediately link that to Loki or maybe
Mhm.
Anansi. And, the trickster god is very familiar to us. And that made me wonder, is the controlling presence some kind of trickster god? And
Mhm.
that's what they're reading in over Matt. And that God is in control of Matt, or has been awakened within Matt. Is it the old blood awakened within Matt that's there? And that all, it would make sense to me if the trickster was a Forsaken, or there was a Forsaken that was a trickster,
Mhm.
because of how they've built that kind of, we'll call it a pantheon, even though that's not really, they're not really gods, but it
Yeah.
kind of works in that same sense. So that felt like interesting development. Remind me what you said the first one was.
Son of
The
Battles.
and we do know that this other presence in Matt was a general, was a leader on the
Yeah.
battlefield, and had some kind of larger presence. So all of those seem to apply not to Matt Coffin of the Two Rivers.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I still can't really give you much in the way of any resolution for this. Literally, Matt was going to ask the question that could resolve it, and then he just decided not to because he got angry. So blame Matt Cawthon, I suppose. We've already broken down what we think Moiraine and Rand were asking within the arches, but we haven't really done much yet about kind of the interpersonal dynamic between the three after they exit the arches. Was there anything in that sequence that you stood out to you or gave you information you didn't have? I just needed to once again point out Matt claiming that he found out about the arches in a book in the most least convincing way that has ever existed. But other than that joke, I didn't really have too many like big pieces to pull out here. What stood out to you?
The detail that he needed to confirm he had no iron or instruments
Mm,
seemed really random, and then the fact that he carefully hid that made it feel like that was more of a clue than I thought, right? So
yeah.
how I read those last interactions is the things they hide from each other are the things that could unlock or unravel all this in a way that's most productive.
Mhm.
And whereas that was a detail I was like, oh, this doesn't really matter. It felt like, oh, if it's getting reference here, it feels like there is something
Yeah.
greater to that. And instruments makes me think of Gleeman and what we've learned about Gleeman and separating them from that. But I don't have a full understanding of what the larger significance of that might be,
Yeah.
and look forward to learning more about it. I thought it just wanted to confirm that Rand and Moiraine are in tension, and Moiraine, who we've always thought of as kind of in control and making
Yeah.
good, strong choices, or having a sense of where to go, even if she didn't tell us that, seems a bit more directionless than we've seen her before.
Yeah, I think that's definitely accurate. And I think Rand's response to that is really interesting, right? Because she clearly doesn't know what the plan is. And so her hope, it seems like, is to be advising Rand, right? She offers, can I help you interpret the answers that you got in the arch? And Rand's response is like, nah, you got to open up first. And that's a really interesting response to Moraine, who is a character who has opened up a grand total of 0 times in the 3.5 books that we've read so far. Um, I have nothing else to add here. I think you're nailing what that interpersonal relationship looks like, but Rand's response to it is just as interesting to me as kind of the tension that you're describing in Moraine. The only other detail that I kind of wanted to pull out here is apparently everyone through the arches was speaking the old tongue, and Matt does that without realizing it far better than I think we previously realized.
And it's not Through the Glass Arches. Our show is called Through the Glass Columns. I don't know. I don't listen to the intro that often.
Yeah, sadly, this
Or
is
the
not
outro.
what we are going through. I'm sorry. We've got another 4 or 5 weeks ish.
All right. Well, wait a minute. Now my math. This isn't going to be my birthday present at all because we're like a week from my birthday, aren't we? I don't know. That's
Yeah.
not interesting talk to the audience. So, I feel satisfied with this chapter. I will just say, I do understand why you might reread this over and over again, right? And try to pick out which of these details confirm things that eventually happen. It makes sense to me, even if I do not myself feel compelled at this time to reread it.
Give it 4 or 5 weeks. We'll see how you're feeling. Chapter 16. Leavetakings. Perrin wakes after dreams of the gallows and weight cloaks. The palace is kind of slowly recovering as he makes his way through. He sees a large number of workers in the Megere trying to put everything back together. He arrives at Loyal's room. He is greeted, and Loyal is lightly injured, and Fail is also there. She tells the story of how Loyal saved a large number of children and their mothers during the attack. And Fail insists that Loyal is a hero, and while doing so, is kind of constantly needling at Perrin for the things that he, wouldn't do or things he won't take credit for. Ogier are in the city, we learn, and Loyal is kind of officially a runaway and is very worried that as soon as one of the Ogier arrives back at the steading, that then everyone will know where he is and his mother will be able to come get him. Perrin tries to take advantage of this and basically say, look, if you want to be somewhere where your mother isn't expecting you, why don't you take me to the Two Rivers? Loyal seems perfectly excited to do this, but then Fail reminds him that she had Loyal swear that he would take Fail first through the ways before anyone else, and that he would take her wherever she'd like to go. She says that she would like to go to the Two Rivers and that Perrin cannot come along unless he specifically asks her. Loyal says, this makes me uncomfortable, and Fail's like, I don't care. You need to keep your promise. Perrin, being 17, does not, or probably 18 or 19 at this point, does not agree to kind of ask Fail and tell her that he wants to go with her. And so as a result, he decides that he is going to follow along behind. This will be more dangerous. It's more likely that he misses a turn or will be attacked by Mach and Shin, but he doesn't need to tell his girlfriend that she's right. And we've all been in that position. Sometimes we just don't want to do that. Perrin then leaves the room, and he is approached by Gaul, the Aiel, who he previously had helped out of a cage in the previous book. Gaul tells him that Rand spoke to Gaul, asked him to travel with Perrin, and when he is told that they are going to be traveling through the ways, he has the most Aiel response ever: death comes for all men. We then switch into the girl's perspective, I believe Elaine's. They are discussing Rand seeming indifferent. When Elaine told him that she was leaving, he almost seemed happy about that fact, and they are very upset about this. They are packing up and dividing the gold that Moiraine gave them. Suddenly, the door is thrown open and Lan enters. He is furious that Nynaeve let him believe that she would be returning to the tower when actually she's going to Tanchico. Lan fears for her in Tanchico, but Nynaeve denies him, saying that she would not allow Lan to go with him, and that there should be basically no reason that Lan should be doubting either Moiraine or Siuan. If they trust Nynaeve, he should trust them as well. Lan continues to offer to protect her. She insists he must go with Moiraine. At this point, she shows him the Merlin's letter, trying to get him to just kind of back off to obey the letter. He does back off, but when he's called full of himself, he responds by making out with her. She says she won't be manhandled, and he declares his love to her in kind of poetic terms. He then says, "As you command, so do I obey." And Nynaeve basically dismisses him. He leaves, and then when Nynaeve is asked by the girls why she didn't let Lan come with him, she says that she denied Lan because she wants him without the kind of broken oath to Moiraine lingering over them. And when she's asked, what are you going to do then, because any way of winning Lan would result in that broken oath, she basically doesn't seem to have any plans, but knows what she wants, and it's not Lan giving up on Moiraine. At this point, Nynaeve insists that things will just be as they need to be, and they need to move on. They all hug, and Elaine resolves that she is going to write Rand a second letter, because the first one she sent him that said she loved him probably sent not the ideal message. End of chapter, on a weird note where I had to recap something I probably should have said in the first half of my recap. What were your thoughts on this chapter? This is the move the pieces around the most of all three, as far as I'm concerned. And you could either kind of see that as like, this is a placeholder chapter that just gets us where we need to be,
Or you could see it as kind of the beginning of that momentum we talked about. We're really starting to kind of know where characters are going. I know your answer is going to be somewhere in between those two, but which of those options do you tend to think is more likely?
Well, I think when we previewed this last week, I said Leavetakings, we're finally going to get on our way, and we're not quite there yet, but it is, giving us the sense that we're moving towards that. So,
Mhm.
so no real complaint about that, but it's just we're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
More than anything in my notes, I just wrote down like this is why Tylor asked about Gaul. Like Gaul is clearly getting the promotion here.
Yeah.
And I think, you're noting a kind of pattern of Robert Jordan, which is like bring up a character 2 or 3 times in
Mhm.
like 5 chapters and then say, oh, this is actually one of your new main character kind of
Yeah.
deals. So the fact that he's been assigned to them, makes sense and, will be a part of this story moving forward. What it also, though, represents here when we now have Aviendra,
No
right?
R, but
Uh,
almost. Avienda.
Avienda. And we have Gaul. It's that really the Aiel are in every plot now,
Yeah.
right? Like each strand of our crew, it's like we're getting the reshuffling of our old characters, but we're really putting the Aiel in as well.
Yeah.
And so back to what I said a couple chapters ago, because I didn't want to give away this specific point, is that it just does feel like prior to this, the books have not demonstrated how central the Aiel are going to be to this. And I think when
Mhm.
they got named as the people of the dragon, this was a clear sign that we are taking a turn. And now we're seeing what that means is that
Yeah.
for their own motivation, they're going to place themselves in all these strands moving forward. So beyond that, I mean, we can kind of take the two halves separately. I'm going to say that that's all I really thought about the first half. In the second half, I gotta say I'm continuing to fail. At least one of our listeners I know in particular, but probably more than that, where I just say like I'm still not feeling Nynaeve and Lan, and this kind of tension of I want him but on the right
Ooh.
terms. That doesn't really work for me. So, oh, Tylor is the listener I'm disappointing. I forgot you listened. So, I don't know.
Apparently.
It didn't work that well for me.
I am willing to wait on why I actually love this romance chapter for when we discuss the second half of the chapter. But it is worth noting, yeah, that's kind of what we got here, right? We've got a dysfunctional teenage relationship between Perrin and Fael, which plays out very accurately, but also really frustratingly as a reader when you're just like, y'all, just talk. Please just say words to each other.
And they just don't.
Well, I'll interrupt you only to say that the note in my book is, oh, so this is going to be the whole book is this like tension
Yep.
of you can't come with me, I'm coming with you. You can't come with me, I need to protect you. No, I can take care of myself. It's like, yeah, we've had this 3 or 4 times in these first
Yep.
few chapters, so it just feels like more of that. Please continue.
The only other note I really had, because you're exactly right, it's just like, oh my God, grow up. I know you're only 18, but please like become an adult soon. The only other note I have is about Loyal, actually. This is a character who has been with us more or less since the very beginning, right? He shows up halfway through the first book, but he hasn't really gotten any real kind of on-screen featured moments, right? He is more or less non-existent in the climax of the first and second book. In the third book, he's just kind of along for the ride. But now we get this really interesting story. I don't know how Loyal holds the door against Trollocs and Merdrail, but either he is an incredible fighter or he was literally holding a large door so they couldn't push it over. Either way, Hero Loyal is a new look and one that I'm kind of excited to see if we get a little bit more kind of on-screen moments as opposed to just recaps in this chapter.
Hodor. Hodor. Uh, uh, Really, the only part of Game of Thrones I end up liking in the end is Hodor. So I had to go for that. Yes, and I think I was frustrated when we recapped book 2. I'm like, they made Loyal sit out, and that's
Yeah.
lame. And then it happened again in book 3. So I'm certainly excited to see him get a little more meat on the bone in terms of plot. And we've developed some more of this backstory about how he. I actually keep thinking about the Star Wars Gungans and Jar Jar getting
Yep.
banished. And so I think Loyal's saying, like, Misa been banished. Crashed into the boss's head clipper. Yeah, I can't do all that. We have a listener who is going to be mad that I didn't do enough Jar Jar talk. But I will say, I am excited to see him more central because I think it's lame. And I actually was just referring last chapter to the fact that we don't have a lot of non-human races. And,
Yeah.
Ogier are slightly non-human, not totally different, but um to really sidetrack him makes this feel like less high fantasy. So let's
Yeah.
do this. And I think I had confused which chapter brought up a lot of the dangers of the ways, but there's a lot of that here.
Yeah.
And a character facing off to certain danger, but in order to help his friends, that's a character I like
Yeah.
9 times out of 10, right? So
That's actually my favorite part about the end of this chapter is Gaul's response to the immense amount of danger that they're in. He's just like, yeah, I'm going to die someday. Might as well be in the ways. And like, that's just kind of a rad response. Any last thoughts on the first half of this? Like Loyal's a hero. Fail and Perrin are a little bit dysfunctional. Gaul is rad. Anything else?
yeah, I just wanted to say the actual language. Death comes for all men is a good reason to do anything, right?
Yeah.
That's the Wheel of Time YOLO, I guess, just to make a 2007-ish reference. I don't know. I still am in a place where I think that YOLO is a recent reference. And then I was watching an episode of The Office that was 10 years old, and they say YOLO
Yeah.
ironically, like the fad is already passed. I'm like, oh. Yeah, I guess time has passed a little on YOLO. So, but doesn't that just mean you should use it and not care, right? It just reinforces the message.
As a nerd who has a podcast about a book series that everyone thought I was lame for reading in high school, just do it. It'll be fun. When we are talking about Elaine and the girls, I actually found the non-land parts of this chapter almost as intriguing to me as the land section, right? We get this really interesting detail about Moiraine actually supporting the girls and how they're kind of, making their plans and what they're going to do. And then we get this kind of emotional friendshipy moment at the end, which really worked for me. Group hugs are normally something that I roll my eyes at, but for whatever reason, it's effective here. Other than the romance plot, which I know you're not a fan of, and I weirdly am, what are your thoughts on this second half of the chapter?
Hold on. Siri, make a note, trap Tylor in a group hug on his birthday. Thanks, Siri.
Oh God,
I hope I
please
didn't
don't.
just I think I probably just triggered everybody's phone who's listening. Now everybody's got a reminder, which is just what the plan requires. I mean, I already used the joke that there was a section in the first chapter that was like, let's make sure we fail the Bechdel test. This a little bit felt like that to me.
Yeah,
It's like we've got these interesting, compelling characters on their own, and they just want to talk about boys.
yeah,
What it felt like more than anything, and I'm going to just sound a little cynical, is like, let's make sure it's clear that none of these relationships are a set deal.
yeah,
They are all still in flux. So if you thought any of these could be relied upon, Elaine is nervous, Nynaeve is nervous, Egwene doesn't know who she loves. And so it's anybody's game. And I thought that was kind of the point that if this is a part of the book you like, hang on because it's not going to
yeah.
be an easy road to children in a two-car garage.
Yeah, I think that's a really good call, is that this is very much the romantic roadblocks chapter to some degree, right? We get Elaine and her two potentially letters to Rand and his reaction to her leaving. Obviously, Egwene and Rand had their all too inevitable breakup like 12 chapters ago. And then Lan shows up. And you apparently are bored, and I cannot have any reaction but, oh my God, how did I not think to say this to a woman when I hear things like, you have made a place in my heart where I thought there was no room for anything else. You have made flowers grow where I cultivated dust and stones. Like, Jesus, that's beautiful. And it's from Lan. What?
Well, and it's very hard not to picture a handsome land from the TV show.
Mhm.
I feel like all our characters got to glow up when they cast them with cool actors, but Land might be the one where I was like, oh, wow, you found a stud for this job. So absolutely. I think let's print calendars of the Land actor in that language or Valentine's. Who
Yeah.
knows when we're recording. And so I think it does work. I'm not saying it's unfeeling. I will say that it is nice that it's happening on screen, because so much of why I kind of missed that plot and listeners enjoyed my befuddlement is because it happened off screen and there are little hints, but not a
Yeah.
lot of like, here is them in love. And so it's nice that that moves to the center. I also think in an episode for this book, I said, I hope we get to see Nynaeve and Lan interact and find a way to kind of come to terms with some of what they've been through. I don't know that this fully kind of was the conversation I wanted them to have, but it is nice that we didn't waste the opportunity of them being in the same city to actually do something, because I kind of think we wasted that opportunity in book 2.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. To some degree, why I love the romance section of this chapter is because it exists, right? My biggest problem with Robert Jordan is that he likes to tell us these two characters like each other, and then 3 books later, after they haven't been in a room together, their relationship advances, right? This was the problem I have with Rand and Elaine earlier in this book, right? Is these are characters who are supposedly head over heels for each other, despite the fact that they have met all of once. And that doesn't super always work for me. And so actually getting to see this on screen and see the reactions and kind of the back and forth of it, all of that makes me go, okay, this is a real romance plot. I'm now willing to see where it goes, as opposed to in the first book where I'm like, okay, that was a really beautiful scene, but it's hard to get super invested in a relationship if you don't see the characters on screen together relatively frequently. I guess the only other thing I have here is there is a brief moment in this scene where I get really, really uncomfortable because Nynaeve resists being kissed for like 15 seconds, and that's not okay in modern world. But it's Robert Jordan. It's totally fine, right, y'all? It was the 90s.
Is it the character, or
Yeah.
like the author is not endorsing that position as well? Yes, and I do think, boy, maybe I shouldn't even wade into those troubled waters, but I do think it's hard to express the very true human thing when
Yeah.
you resist but really do want it, and
Totally.
that muddies the water on issues of consent, and obviously not in a way that's acceptable, particularly by modern sensibilities compared to the 90s. But I do think it's hard to express that feeling when you're in a different character's head, right? So, not my favorite, but certainly as the kind of capper on these 3 episodes, it has just felt like increasing momentum. I'm ready to get these plots going. I'm ready to have everybody give their hugs goodbye, or it does feel like we have a couple people doing is it the Irish goodbye, where you just slip out of the party and don't say anything, which is pretty much how I do parties. So I feel like I'm excited to see that coming up next week. So listeners should know that we are moving back to 2 chapters. So we will be covering chapter 17, Deceptions, and chapter 18, Into the Ways, for next week's podcast, which ends up in my mass market paperback being about 30 pages. So I just want to note, like, it has been a kind of slow, let's make sure we check in with all these characters, a little character building time. But it's kind of shocking to me that we're already, by my edition, 264 pages into a 993 page book. So it's like a quarter of this is already under our belts, and it feels like we're still just getting started. So we hope you're excited by the journey, and we hope you're excited for it. And we can't wait to continue it next time. When, Tyler?
Through the glass columns, probably.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass, and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.